There are tombs in the galaxy that should never be opened. Sarcophagi that contain not the honored dead, but something far more terrible. Something that exists in the liminal space between life and death, caught in an endless cycle of rage and darkness. In the grim darkness of the far future, some sleeping giants should be left to their slumber, their nightmares contained within shells of adamantium and ceramite. But the Orks, those green-skinned marauders who view the galaxy as one endless playground of violence and possibility, have never been ones to leave well enough alone. What happens when these irrepressible Xenos stumble upon a relic from humanity's darkest hours? What occurs when Ork curiosity meets cornate fury? This is the story of collision between two of the galaxy's most violent forces, a tale of scrap metal and blood, of mech boy ingenuity and berserker rage. The answer, as you might expect in this universe where there is only war, is nothing short of catastrophic. The Tool, World Eaters, from glory to damnation. To understand the horror that awaits the unsuspecting Orks, we must first understand what a World Eater's Dreadnought truly is. These war machines are not simply weapons, not mere vehicles of destruction. They are prisons of flesh and metal, tombs for warriors who died, but were denied the peace of death. They are monuments to rage incarnate, to fury so pure and consuming that it has transcended mortality itself. The World Eaters Legion was not always the blood-soaked nightmare that it became. Once, millennia ago, during the golden age of the Great Crusade, they were known as the Warhounds. They were the Emperor's shock troops, drawn from no particular region of terror, but instead selected through mysterious psychological screening processes. From their very inception, these warriors were marked by an unusual temperament. They were hot-blooded and savage, yes, but they were also disciplined and controlled. They fought with a ferocity that few could match, yet they did so within the bounds of military doctrine and imperial law. Everything changed when they found their primarch, Angron, the Lord of the Red Sands, the Red Angel himself, was discovered on the brutal slave world of Nuceria. Unlike many of his brothers who were found ruling kingdoms or leading armies, Angron was discovered as a slave, a gladiator forced to fight and kill for the entertainment of callous masters. The High Riders of Nuceria had done something unspeakable to him, something that would echo through the millennia and damn entire star systems to oceans of blood. They had implanted archaeotech devices into his brain, cybernetic implants known as the Butcher's Nails. These were not simple augmentations designed to enhance combat ability. They were torture devices, mechanisms of exquisite cruelty that caused constant, searing agony. The only respite from the pain came in the act of violence itself. Only when Angron killed, only when he spilled blood and crushed bone, did the nails grant him a moment's peace. The Emperor rescued Angron from Nuceria, but he could not save him from the nails. The technology was beyond even the most skilled Mechanicum adepts to safely remove. Angron was broken in ways that could never be repaired, condemned to an existence where the only escape from torment was through the destruction of others. When he took command of his legion and renamed them the World Eaters, he brought with him the practices and philosophy of the gladiatorial pits. More than that, he demanded that his own apothecaries and tech marines reverse engineer the Butcher's Nails and implant them into every warrior of the Legion. The Mechanicum protested. They explained that they could not perfectly replicate Angron's implants, that the devices they created were crude approximations that would rob the bearers of peace and joy, leaving only the satisfaction found in battle. Angron did not care. His sons, desperate to understand their father, to forge some connection with the broken god who led them, volunteered for the procedure in droves. They underwent the psychosurgery willingly, allowing the nails to be hammered into their brains, binding them to existence of perpetual rage and bloodlust. From that point forward, the World Eaters became something more and less than human. They were the most effective shock troops in the Imperium's arsenal, capable of overwhelming any enemy through sheer ferocity and relentless aggression. But they were also monsters, warriors who would sometimes continue killing long after the battle was won, unable to stop the flow of violence once it had begun. At Genna, an entire planetary population was butchered in a single night by World Eaters unable or unwilling to deny the bloodlust unleashed by their implants. The Emperor himself censured Angron and ordered him to cease the practice of implanting his warriors with the nails. Angron ignored him. When the Horus heresy erupted and the War Master turned against the Emperor, the World Eaters were among the first to join the rebellion. Not because they believed in Horus's vision or harbored any particular grudge against the Master of Mankind, but because the promise of endless war was too intoxicating to resist. On the killing fields of Istvan, in the blood-soaked corridors of Terra's imperial palace, the World Eaters gave themselves fully to slaughter. And in that orgy of violence, they attracted the attention of something ancient and terrible, a power that had waited since the first murder in the first cave on the first world, where sentient life evolved. Horn, the blood god, the Lord of Skulls, claimed them as his own. The transformation from imperial warriors to chaos devotees was perhaps the most seamless of all the traitor legions. The World Eaters had already embraced rage as their creed and violence as their sacrament. All that changed was the object of their devotion. Where once they had fought for the Emperor's vision of a unified humanity, now they fought for Horn's eternal appetite for blood and skulls. The nails, already a curse beyond measure, became conduits for Hornate power, pumping not just pain, but raw warp energy directly into the warrior's brains. Angron himself was elevated to demonhood, transformed into a towering, winged monstrosity of brass and fury. His legions scattered after the catastrophic Battle of Scalathrax, where Khan the Betrayer earned his title by turning on his own brothers in a blood-mad rampage. From that point forward, the World Eaters ceased to exist as a unified force, instead fragmenting into countless warbands that roam the galaxy in search of worthy foes to slaughter. The condemned, Dreadnoughts of the 12th Legion. Among the many horrors birthed by the World Eaters' fall to chaos, perhaps none are more pitiable than their Dreadnoughts. In the Imperium, to be interred within a Dreadnought is considered one of the highest honors a Space Marine can receive. When a warrior is too gravely wounded to continue serving but too valuable to lose, his broken body is placed within the armored sarcophagus of a Dreadnought war machine. There, sustained by life support systems and neural interfaces, he can continue to serve the Emperor for centuries or even millennia, his consciousness preserved within the shell of the mighty walker. For a loyalist Space Marine, this is a bittersweet fate. The warrior loses his mortal form, his ability to move freely through the world as a man rather than a machine. He must endure long periods of forced hibernation between battles, sleeping in the darkness between deployments. But there is honor in this service, brotherhood in the chambers where the Ancient Ones rest between wars, and the knowledge that he continues to fight for something greater than himself. For a World Eater's Dreadnought, there is no such comfort. Imagine, if you can, the horror of that existence. The butcher's nails were designed for a mortal brain attached to a mortal body capable of engaging in physical violence to quiet the device's torment. But a Dreadnought has no body, save what the war machine provides. He cannot feel the satisfaction of his own hands crushing an enemy's throat. He cannot experience the visceral feedback of Chainax's teeth tearing through flesh and bone. The sensory input is mediated through mechanical sensors, translated into data, rather than felt as direct experience. The nails scream for violence, for blood, for the sensation of killing, but the Dreadnought can never truly satisfy them. Even in battle, even when his assault cannons roar and his power fists crush tanks like tinfoil, the relief is incomplete, filtered through layers of machinery that stand between consciousness and action. And between battles, in the long darkness of enforced sleep, the nails continue their work. They pulse and burn within what remains of organic brain tissue, sending cascades of agony through neural pathways that have nowhere to discharge their fury. Some World Eaters' dreadnoughts go mad during these periods of dormancy, their damaged psyches fragmenting under the relentless assault of pain and frustrated bloodlust. Others, perhaps worse, become something no longer quite sane or mad, but rather something in between. They develop a kind of terrible clarity, an understanding of what they have become and what has been taken from them. The first Berserker dreadnoughts appeared during the Horus heresy itself, modifications of the Contemptor pattern optimized for close combat assaults. These machines were made larger and swifter than their standard counterparts, built to charge headlong into enemy lines in near-suicidal assaults. The World Eaters deployed them with reckless abandon, hurling these shrieking war machines at the strongest points of enemy formations, using them as battering rams of ceramite and fury to break defensive lines before the main force followed in their wake. Many of these ancient dreadnoughts survived the heresy, carried by their warbands into the Eye of Terror when the traitor legions were finally driven from real space. There, in that realm, where the laws of reality bend before the will of the dark gods, time flows strangely. A warrior might fight for what feels like days only to emerge and find centuries have passed in the material universe. Conversely, one might sleep for what seems like an eternity within the warp's timeless currents, awakening to find that mere moments have elapsed in the physical realm. For the World Eaters, dreadnoughts trapped within the Eye, this temporal distortion adds yet another layer of torment to their existence. They cannot even trust their own sense of time's passage, cannot know if they have slumbered for hours or millennia. But the Eye of Terror is not the only place where ancient war machines might be found. The galaxy is vast, and the 10,000 years since the heresy have seen countless battles fought across innumerable worlds. Warbands of chaos space marines roam the darkness between stars, launching raids and full-scale invasions wherever they smell weakness, or simply the promise of worthy combat. In the chaos of battle and retreat, equipment is sometimes left behind. Ships are destroyed with their holds full of war material. Facilities are abandoned when more pressing threats demand attention elsewhere. And sometimes, just sometimes, a dreadnought sarcophagus enters hibernation mode and is simply forgotten. For a World Eater's dreadnought powered down in some forgotten hold or abandoned facility, the experience of 1,000 years of sleep might feel like the blink of an eye, or it might feel like drowning in an ocean of agony, conscious but unable to move or scream or fight, trapped within a shell of metal with only the butcher's nails for company. The truth is that no one knows, because those who wake from such slumber are rarely coherent enough to explain their experience. They wake screaming, metaphorically if not literally, their rage so consuming and so desperate that reason has long since been burned away. This is what the Orks are about to discover. The Ork menace, green and brutal. To understand what happens next in our tale, we must turn our attention to the other half of this equation. The Orks are one of the galaxy's most successful species, perhaps even outnumbering humanity itself, if one counts every fungoid greenskin, from the mightiest warlord to the smallest grot. They are a species seemingly designed for war, from their incredibly tough physiology to their instinctive understanding of violence. But to call them merely warlike would be to miss something fundamental about Orkish nature. The Orks are not cruel. They do not take sadistic pleasure in causing suffering the way a Dark Eldar might, nor do they kill out of calculated ambition or faith like the adherents of the ruinous powers. The Orks fight because fighting is what they do, as natural and necessary to them as breathing is to a human. They are joyful in battle, exuberant in violence, approaching warfare with an enthusiasm that can seem almost childlike if one forgets the mountains of corpses they leave in their wake. An Ork doesn't hate his enemies any more than a child hates the toys he breaks. The enemy is simply there, an obstacle to overcome, a problem to solve through the liberal application of violence. This attitude extends to every aspect of Ork culture. They are curious in the way that an extremely destructive toddler is curious. willing to poke and prod and smash things just to see what happens. Give an orc a mysterious device, and he will immediately start pressing buttons and pulling levers, not out of malice, but out of pure interest in seeing what the thing does. If it explodes and kills him, well, that's just bad luck. If it works, then he's got a new toy to play with. This combination of fearlessness and curiosity makes orcs extremely dangerous because they are willing to experiment with things that more cautious species would wisely leave alone. The orcs were created as a warrior race during the ancient war in heaven, when the Old Ones fought desperately against the soulless Necrons and their terrible Catan masters. The Old Ones, those ancient architects of life, needed soldiers that could be deployed quickly and sustain themselves in almost any environment. What they created was a species that reproduced through spores, that grew from the very ground like aggressive fungus, and that possessed an unusual form of collective psychic power. This Gestalt psychic field is what makes orc technology function in defiance of physical laws. Enough orcs believing something is true can actually make it true, bending reality to conform to collective expectation. This is why orc vehicles painted red actually go faster, why their ramshackle guns that should never fire somehow spit death across battlefields, and why orc mech boys can build functional war machines from what looks like random piles of scrap metal. The mech boys themselves are odd boys, orcs, who are born with instinctive understanding of mechanical principles encoded into their very DNA. They don't study engineering in the way a human or Tau engineer might. They simply know, on a genetic level, how to build things that work. Or more precisely, how to build things that orcs believe should work, which then work because enough orcs believe in them. A mech boy is to engineering what a weird boy is to psychic power, or a pain boy is to medicine. Each type of odd boy is born with innate knowledge that would take a human years of study to accumulate. The mech boys can look at a pile of scrap and instinctively understand which bits can be bashed together to make a functioning vehicle. They can salvage nearly any wreck and cobble it back together with new parts, fresh paint, and more enthusiasm than actual craftsmanship. The sight of a battle wagon that has been reported destroyed dozens of times, each time simply patched up and sent back into battle, is commonplace in orc warfare. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of orc psychology for our story: their relationship with loot. Orcs are natural scavengers, drawn to the detritus of battle like crows to a battlefield. But they don't scavenge in the way that desperate humans might pick over ruins looking for food or supplies. Orcs scavenge because they genuinely find enemy technology interesting and because they believe, often correctly, that they can make it work better than its original owners. An orc mech boy will look at a damaged Imperial tank and see not a ruined machine, but the potential for something proper orky. The orcs possess a unique ability to make looted technology function, despite having no formal understanding of its operating principles. A mech boy can take a human tank, bang on it a bit, maybe slap on some armor plates and a larger gun, and somehow get it running again. This works partly because of their instinctive understanding of mechanics, and partly because their psychic field literally makes things work that shouldn't. The Adeptus Mechanicus has observed that orc weapons sometimes cease to function when examined in controlled Imperial laboratories, only to roar back to life when placed in the hands of an orc. This has led to considerable theological distress among the tech priests, who struggle to reconcile their understanding of machine spirits with the apparent reality of orc psychoengineering. Orc culture is organized around a simple hierarchy. The biggest orc is in charge until a bigger orc comes along and proves it through violence. This leads to a constantly shifting social structure where ambition and ability are rewarded with increased status, and where failure is punished by getting your head kicked in by someone stronger. But within this brutal meritocracy, there's also a sense of grudging respect for skill. A truly talented mech boy who can build impressive war machines will be valued by his war boss and protected, relatively speaking, from the general violence that characterizes Ork society. After all, you don't kill the one Ork who knows how to keep your favorite battle wagon running. Orks are also remarkably resistant to chaos corruption, though not entirely immune. Their psychic gestalt is anchored by their own gods, Gork and Mork, and their simple, straightforward psychology doesn't provide much purchase for the whispers of the dark gods. An Ork doesn't feel the despair that might make him vulnerable to Nurgle, lacks the ambition that Tzeentch feeds upon, doesn't experience the sensation-seeking that Slaanesh cultivates. As for Khorne, while it's true that Orks love violence, they fight for fundamentally different reasons than Khornate berserkers. An Ork fights for the joy of the fight itself, not to please some distant deity or to feed an insatiable bloodlust. The blood god might appreciate Ork violence in the way one appreciates a particularly enthusiastic amateur, but the Orks themselves remain largely indifferent to his claims upon their souls. This resistance to chaos is important for our story, because it means that the Orks who stumble upon our sleeping Dreadnought will approach it with curiosity rather than fear or reverence. They won't sense the Khornate taint that would make more chaos-sensitive species recoil in horror. They won't feel the spiritual weight of 1,000 years of accumulated rage and bloodshed. To them, it will simply be a big metal git that looks like it might be worth investigating. The discovery, scrap or treasure. The world where our story takes place is one of millions like it scattered across the galaxy. It had once been prosperous, a minor forge world producing munitions and basic war material for the Imperium's endless conflicts. Then the Horus heresy had swept through this sector like a tide of fire, and worlds that had known 10,000 years of relative peace suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a civil war that threatened to tear reality itself apart. The World Eaters had come here as part of a larger chaos offensive, their blood-red armor staining the assembly floors of manufactorums as they butchered their way through defenders who had never imagined they would face space marines in battle. The defenders had fought bravely. They had died to the last man, woman, and child. And in the chaos of the World Eaters' eventual withdrawal, pursued by arriving loyalist forces, equipment had been left behind. Vehicles too damaged to move quickly, ammunition stockpiles the berserkers had no use for, and in a sealed subterranean hangar, connected to what had once been a field hospital for the attacking forces, a single Dreadnought sarcophagus rested in forced hibernation. His name, before the nails had stripped away such frivolous concerns, had been Captain Valdor Keir of the World Eaters' 7th Assault Company. He had led his men across a dozen worlds during the Great Crusade, had stood beside Angron during the Primarch's darkest hours, and had volunteered for the nails knowing full well what the procedure would cost him. On Nuceria, during the Butcher's Nail's bloody homecoming, Valdor had taken a plasma blast that had vaporized everything below his ribcage. His apothecaries had saved what remained, and his tech marines had built him a new body of adamantium and rage. For 300 years, Valdor had served as a dreadnought. He had fought in the heresy's bloodiest battles, had killed loyalists and traitors alike with equal enthusiasm, had felt the Nail's song reach new heights of anguished ecstasy as Khorne's power flooded through his systems. But 300 years of constant warfare had taken their toll on his ancient systems. Following a particularly brutal engagement against Emperor's Children forces, his support team had placed him in hibernation mode for repairs that the Boers, Warband's fleeing tech marines, had never returned to complete. That was 1,000 years ago, Imperial reckoning. For Valdor, it had been an eye blink. One moment he was powering down, the Nail's shriek fading to a dull roar as his consciousness flickered toward darkness. The next, nothing. No dreams, no awareness, no sense of time's passage. Just void, and the Nails, always the Nails, burning like red-hot wires threaded through what remained of his brain. The world above had changed considerably since he went to sleep. The Imperium had eventually reclaimed this sector, though at tremendous cost. The damaged Forge world had been deemed too corrupted to restore fully, its population centers purged with flame and virus bombs. New colonists had been brought in, worked the cleaned facilities for several generations, and then been killed when an Eldar raid left the world vulnerable to Ork invasion. The Orks had conquered, squabbled among themselves, and mostly moved on to more interesting targets, leaving behind a small population of feral greenskins who gradually devolved into primitive tribes warring over the ruins. 300 years after the Orks' departure, a new war swept through the sector. This one was led by a particularly successful war boss named Grit Stomper, who had united several rival tribes through a combination of personal charisma, brutal violence, and the possession of a truly impressive power claw. Grit Stomper's war had grown large enough that it needed more resources, more vehicles, more guns. The war boss, demonstrating an unusual amount of strategic thinking for an Ork, had sent several of his mech boys back to worlds the Greenskins had conquered before, with orders to get all the good bits. This is how mech boy Zagdaka and his crew of spanners found themselves exploring the ruins of the old Forge world, specifically the underground levels that previous Ork looters had either missed or deemed not worth the effort of excavating. Zagdaka was a big mech of considerable skill and reputation, having built 3 separate stompers that had lasted more than a single battle before exploding. He had a reputation for being able to make anything work, and he approached the task of scavenging with the methodical enthusiasm of an Ork who genuinely loved his work. The sealed hangar had resisted casual attempts at entry for centuries. Its blast doors were made of reinforced adamantium, its locking mechanisms fused by ancient damage and millennia of neglect. But Zagdaka had brought cutting torches, breaching charges, and a truly staggering amount of enthusiasm. It took the better part of a day, but eventually the Orks managed to cut through the door's seams, exposing the chamber beyond. The air that rushed out was stale beyond imagining, chemical preservatives, and 1,000-year-old lubricants, creating a miasma that would have been toxic to humans. The Orks, possessing considerably more robust constitutions, simply wrinkled their noses at the smell and pushed forward. Zagdaka led the way, his helmet-mounted lamp cutting through the darkness to reveal the hangar's contents. At first, the mech boy was disappointed. The chamber was mostly empty, its contents looted long ago by other scavengers or removed by the World Eaters themselves during their withdrawal. But then his light fell upon something in the far corner, half hidden behind a fallen gantry and covered in dust so thick it looked like grey snow. It was massive, nearly 12 feet tall even in its powered-down crouch, its silhouette unmistakably that of a Dreadnought. Zagdaka felt his 2 hearts begin to pound with excitement. A Dreadnought, even a broken one, would have enough valuable components to build a whole warband worth of vehicles. The power plant alone was worth the trip, and if any of the weapons were still attached, well, that would be a bonus beyond measure. He motioned his spanners forward, and together they began to clear away the debris. As they worked, more details became visible. The Dreadnought was clearly of Chaos origin, its armor plates decorated with the 8-fold star and other symbols that the Orks vaguely recognized as chaosy. The metal had a strange quality to it, not quite the clean lines of Imperial manufacture, but rather a more organic appearance, as if the adamantium had been shaped as much by will as by tools. Rust-red paint that might once have been crimson covered most of the chassis, and if one looked closely, one could see chains welded to the surface, from which dangled what might have once been skulls, though they had long since crumbled to dust. The most striking feature was the sarcophagus itself. Unlike Loyalist Dreadnoughts, which typically featured clean lines and efficient design, this one had been modified extensively. Chains wrapped around it like ceremonial bindings. Brass studs formed runes and symbols that seemed to writhe when looked at directly. And set into the front of the sarcophagus, just above where the main viewport would be, was a brass icon of a skull with horns and fangs, the mark of Khorne, rendered in such exquisite detail that even the Orks could tell it was meant to be important. "What you think, boss?" asked one of the spanners, a young orc named Gripfist. "Think it still works?" Zagdaka circled the dreadnought slowly, his experienced eye cataloguing every detail. The armor showed considerable battle damage, lass burns and bolter impacts forming constellations across its surface. One of its arms terminated in what looked like a massive power fist, the fingers frozen in a crushing grip. The other mounted what appeared to be some kind of multi-barreled weapon, though time and corrosion had obscured its exact nature. Both legs showed signs of repair, their actuators wrapped in crude armor plates that suggested field modifications done in haste. But what really caught Zagdaka's attention was the power plant. Even dormant, even after 1,000 years, there was something about it that suggested potential. The containment housing was intact, its seals unbroken despite the millennia of neglect. If the reactor core was still viable, if the fuel hadn't decayed beyond usefulness, then this machine might still be functional, not just salvageable for parts, but actually operational. The mech boy's mind raced with possibilities. A working dreadnought, even a chaos one, would be an incredible prize. He could study its systems, learn its secrets, maybe even figure out how to make more like it. Or better yet, he could get it running and present it to Warboss Gritstomper as a gift. The boss was always saying he needed more killy things, and what was killier than a dreadnought? "Where's gonna wake it up?" Zagdaka declared, his voice carrying the absolute confidence of an orc who had made a decision and would not be swayed. The other orcs looked at each other nervously. Even greenskins could sense that there was something not quite right about this machine, something that made the air around it feel heavy and strange. But Zagdaka was the big mech, and he had spoken. Besides, they were curious too. What orc wouldn't want to see what happened when you turned on a 1,000-year-old chaos dreadnought? Attempts to wake the beast. What followed was a masterclass in orcish engineering, which is to say, a combination of intuitive brilliance, absolute recklessness, and the kind of optimism that can only come from having absolutely no idea how dangerous something might be. Zagdaka approached the problem of waking the dreadnought with the same enthusiasm a human child might approach a new toy, completely unburdened by concepts like safety protocols or containment procedures. The first step was to determine what state the machine was actually in. Zagdaka had his spanners clear away more debris, exposing the dreadnought's full structure and providing access to its various systems. The mech boy then produced an assortment of tools that would have made a Mechanicus tech priest weep with horror. Some were actually designed for diagnostic work, salvaged from Imperial equipment and modified for orc hands. Others were simply hammers and pry bars that Zagdaka believed would be useful for getting at the worky bits. The dreadnought's armor proved resistant to casual inspection. Unlike Imperial machines designed with maintenance in mind, this chassis had been modified to protect its occupant from external threats at the cost of accessibility. Chaos modifications had further complicated things, with sections of armor apparently fused directly to the underlying structure through methods that defied conventional engineering. Zagdaka responded to this challenge in the traditional orc manner. He got a bigger hammer. It took several hours and the sacrifice of 2 perfectly good prying tools, but eventually the mech boy managed to expose one of the main power conduits. What he found was simultaneously encouraging and concerning. The cables themselves appeared intact, their insulation still holding despite a millennium of neglect. But they were connected to a power distribution system that incorporated elements no sane engineer would have included. Crystal matrices grown from materials that seemed to shift colors when not directly observed. Brass fittings engraved with runes that made Zagdaka's eyes water if he looked at them too long. And running through everything, a faint residue of something that might have been oil, but smelled like burnt copper and old blood. "That's weird," Zagdaka muttered, poking at one of the crystals with a screwdriver. The crystal pulsed once. a dull red glow emanating from its core, then went dark again. The mech boy grunted with satisfaction. Weird or not, the system was responding to external stimuli, which meant it wasn't completely dead. This was good. The next challenge was the reactor itself. Zagdaka knew from experience with looted Imperial machinery that Dreadnoughts typically used a compact fusion core or similar high-density power source. This one appeared to follow the same basic principles, but the details were obscured by yet more chaos modifications. The fuel status was impossible to determine without actual diagnostic equipment, and none of the Ork tools had the right connectors. Zagdaka considered this problem for approximately 3 seconds, before deciding to just bypass the safety interlocks and see what happened. Gripfist, displaying unusual wisdom for a young spanner, suggested maybe they should test the power systems on something less potentially dangerous first. "What if it blows up, boss? We won't get no loot if it's all exploded." Zagdaka considered this point. "All right, Den. We test it first. Make sure it's proper worky before we fire up the whole thing." He pointed at another spanner, a grizzled Ork named Skarshiv, who had lost 3 fingers to a poorly timed repair job. "You, get me something we can hook up to the power, see if it flows." Skarshiv rummaged through their equipment and produced a portable lamp, the kind the Orks used for seeing in dark places. It wasn't a sophisticated testing device, but Ork engineering rarely required sophistication. Either power would flow or it wouldn't. If the lamp exploded, well, that would tell them something too. Connecting the lamp to the Dreadnought's power conduits required some creative wiring. Zagdaka spliced their cables directly into what he believed was a secondary power feed, using a combination of crude soldering and the absolute certainty that it would work because he was a proper mech boy, and mech boys knew what they were doing. The other Orks backed away slightly, a rare display of caution, as Zagdaka prepared to throw what he called the power switch, but which was actually just 2 bare wires he was going to touch together. "Ready?" Zagdaka asked, grinning broadly. The other Orks nodded, their eyes fixed on the lamp. Zagdaka touched the wires together. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lamp flickered once, twice, and burst into brilliant illumination. But it wasn't the steady yellow-white glow of normal Ork lighting. Instead, the light was tinged red, pulsing in a rhythm that might have been a heartbeat. The crystal matrices in the power distribution system came alive, each one glowing with that same bloody illumination. And through the conduits, there flowed not just electricity, but something else. Something that made the air taste like metal and caused the temperature in the chamber to drop several degrees. The lamp held for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it exploded with a sound like breaking glass, sending fragments of metal and glass across the chamber. Zagdaka whooped with delight, completely unbothered by the shrapnel that had embedded itself in his shoulder guard. "It works! The power's still good!" This was technically true. The reactor was still functional after 1,000 years of dormancy. Its ancient fuel cells still capable of producing energy. What Zagdaka didn't understand, what no Ork could have understood, was that this wasn't just a power source in the conventional sense. The reactor had been blessed by Cornet tech marines, its operation intertwined with rituals and prayers to the blood god. When it ran, it didn't just produce electricity. It produced wrath, feeding power tinged with the essence of Khorne himself into every system it touched. Undaunted by this development, Zagdaka began the next phase of his plan, actually getting the Dreadnought's main systems online. This would require considerably more work than simply testing a power conduit. He needed to access the command throne, where the pilot's consciousness was housed, needed to find the activation sequences, and needed to make sure that when the machine came online, it did so under some semblance of control. The latter concern was, admittedly, pretty low on Zagdaka's priority list. The mech boy wasn't particularly worried about whether the Dreadnought would be controllable. He just wanted to see if he could make it work. If it then went on a rampage and killed everyone, well, that would be exciting and therefore worthwhile. Finding the command throne proved challenging. The sarcophagus was sealed with locks that incorporated both physical and immaterial components. Cogitator circuits interwoven with brass talismans. Mechanical bolts secured with runes that seemed to shift their position when not directly observed. Zagdaka attacked these defenses with the subtle approach of an avalanche, using power tools and brute force to quite literally tear his way into the systems he wanted to access. What he found inside defied easy description. The pilot's chamber was a nightmarish blend of technology and torture. Amniotic fluids, now centuries old and thick as oil, filled the inner sanctum where a human form was barely visible, suspended in the preservative liquid. Life support systems pulsed with slow, steady rhythm, maintaining biological functions at the absolute minimum level necessary. Neural interfaces, like steel thorns, pierced the pilot's skull at dozens of points, each one connected to systems that carried not just sensory input, but also the accumulated rage of 1,000 years of dormancy. And there, just above where the neural crown attached to the pilot's skull, Zagdaka could see them. The butcher's nails. They were smaller than he expected, delicate almost, like jewelry rather than instruments of war. But there was something about them that made even the orc uncomfortable, a sense of wrongness that even his species' innate resistance to chaos couldn't entirely suppress. The nails pulsed with their own rhythm, slightly out of sync with the life support systems, as if they were alive and waiting. "Boss," Gripfist said nervously, "maybe we should just take the weapons and leave the rest. This don't feel right." Zagdaka waved him off. "Nonsense. We's come all this way. We's gonna see what it does when we turn it on." He studied the systems more carefully, his instinctive understanding of mechanics telling him what needed to happen. There would be an activation sequence, some kind of wake-up protocol that would bring the pilot's consciousness back online and initialize the war machine's combat systems. He just needed to find it and trigger it. The process of actually accomplishing this took most of another day. Zagdaka had to trace power flows, identify critical systems, and bypass safety mechanisms that would have required specific authorization codes to disable. His approach was considerably less elegant than what a Mechanicus tech priest would have attempted, where an Imperial technician might have spent weeks carefully analyzing each system and its relationship to the whole. The mech boy just started connecting things and seeing what happened. Surprisingly, or perhaps not so surprisingly, given the Orcs' unique relationship with technology, his approach actually worked. Through a combination of rewiring, creative use of jumper cables, and at one point literally hitting a stubborn actuator with a wrench until it unstuck, Zagdaka managed to create what he believed was a complete power path from the reactor to the pilot's chamber. All he needed to do now was send the activation signal. "Right then," he announced, standing back from his work. "This should do it. When I throws this switch," he pointed to a lever that he had jury-rigged from spare parts, "the power's gonna flow to the pilot box, and then we'll see what we'll see." The assembled Orcs took up positions around the hangar, most of them finding spots with good visibility, but also convenient access to the exit. Zagdaka, showing either tremendous bravery or tremendous stupidity, remained right next to the Dreadnought, his hand on the activation lever. "For Gork and Mork!" he shouted, and threw the switch. Power surged through the ancient systems. The reactor, awakened from its slumber, roared to life with a sound like grinding metal and distant screams. The crystal matrices blazed red, bathing the entire hangar in crimson light. Life support systems that had maintained minimum function for a millennium suddenly surged to full operational status, pumping fresh nutrients and oxygenated fluid through systems that had been dormant for longer than some civilizations had existed. And in the heart of the machine, in the sanctum where flesh and metal merged into something neither alive nor dead, the butcher's nails began to wake their host. The awakening. Fury incarnate. Valdor Kier had been dreaming, though to call it dreaming does injustice to the experience. In the void between activation and deactivation, where the Dreadnought's pilot exists without truly living. Something like consciousness persists. But it is consciousness stripped of all context, all sensation, save one. The nails had been with him throughout that 1,000-year darkness, their song the only constant in an existence without time or form. They had sung to him of battles he had fought and battles he would fight. They had shown him visions of blood, oceans of it, drowning whole worlds in crimson tides. They had whispered promises of violence that would finally satisfy the hunger that consumed him. And through it all, they had burned. Oh, how they had burned, like hot wires threaded through his brain, never allowing him true rest even in this state that was neither sleep nor waking. When Zagdaka activated the power systems, it was like a dam breaking. Energy flooded through circuits that had known only darkness for a millennium. Systems came online in sequence, each one adding its input to the consciousness, slowly gathering itself within the sarcophagus. Optical sensors flickered to life, showing only blurred images at first as their autofocus mechanisms recalibrated. Auditory systems crackled with static before clearing to reveal the sounds of the hangar. Tactical systems began their startup, sequences searching for enemies and finding something. Green-skinned bipeds, xenos, multiple targets, and the nails, oh the nails, they came fully alive for the first time in 1,000 years. The transition from minimal activity to full operation was instantaneous, and with it came such agony that even Valdor Kier, who had endured this torment for centuries before his interment, nearly fragmented under the assault. The devices screamed their demands directly into what remained of his nervous system, bypassing all filters and safeties, delivering their message with perfect clarity. Kill, destroy, make the blood flow, end the pain through violence. The life support systems, responding to distress signals from their charge's organic components, began flooding Valdor's system with combat stimulants. Chemical cocktails designed to heighten aggression and dull pain receptors, mixed with preservative fluids that had taken on properties best not examined too closely. The combination should have killed a normal human instantly. But Valdor Kier was no normal human. He was a space marine of the World Eaters Legion, a chaos dreadnought who had pledged his soul to Horn, and he had endured torments that would have shattered lesser beings. In the hangar, the Orks watched with mounting concern as the dreadnought's optical sensors began to glow. Not the soft illumination of standard dreadnought vision systems, but a burning red light that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the machine's core. The glow intensified, pulsing in time with some internal rhythm, and with each pulse, the air in the chamber grew heavier, more oppressive, tasting of brass and blood. "Boss," Gripfist said, his voice tighter than before. "Boss, maybe we should—" He never finished the sentence. The dreadnought's right arm, the one mounting the power fist, suddenly jerked upward with a screech of protesting servos. The massive weapon clenched and unclenched, fingers of adamantium scraping against each other to produce a sound like grinding bones. The left arm followed, the multi-barreled weapon rotating to track across the chamber, its targeting systems painting invisible beams across the assembled Orks. Then, for the first time in 1,000 years, Valdor Kier screamed. The sound that emerged from the dreadnought's vox speakers was not human, nor was it entirely mechanical. It was something between the two, a fusion of electronic distortion and raw vocal agony that had been building for a millennium. It was the sound of rage given voice, of hatred distilled to its purest form, of suffering so profound that it had transcended mere physical sensation to become something spiritual, something terrible. The scream echoed through the hangar and beyond, reverberating through the ruins above, causing feral Orks kilometers away to pause in their squabbling and look toward the source with confused concern. In the warp, something noticed. Horn's gaze, that terrible attention that falls upon bloodshed wherever it occurs, turn toward this forgotten world. A champion, one of his chosen, had awakened after long slumber. The blood god's pleasure was not a gentle thing, and reality itself buckled slightly under the weight of his regard. The 8-pointed star carved into the Dreadnought's armor began to glow with an inner fire. The brass chains binding the sarcophagus rattled and steamed, condensation forming on metal that had no business being hot. Zagdaka, to his credit, did not immediately flee. The big mech had faced down charging war bosses, survived catastrophic explosions, and once punched a demon in what he believed was its face. He was not easily intimidated, but there was something about the Dreadnought's awakening that gave even him pause. Something that spoke to survival instincts buried deep in his genetic code. This was not simply a machine waking up. This was something else. Something that the Orks' limited understanding of chaos couldn't quite process, but that his gut insisted was very, very dangerous. "Right then, lads," Zagdaka said, his voice only slightly less confident than usual. "Maybe we should just back up a bit, see what it—" The Dreadnought moved, not with the careful, measured steps of a machine testing its newly activated systems, but with explosive violence that suggested its pilot had been waiting 1,000 years for this moment. The power fist came down, smashing into the floor where Zagdaka had been standing a fraction of a second before. The mech boy threw himself aside with surprising agility for his bulk, and the blow that would have crushed him to paste instead cratered the ferrocrete floor, sending cracks radiating outward like a spiderweb. Valdorkir's tactical systems had completed their startup sequence. Target identification, Ork Xenos, multiple contacts, all within optimal engagement range. Threat assessment, minimal, but that was irrelevant. The Nails didn't care about threat levels. They cared only about whether the target could bleed, and Orks could very definitely bleed. His weapon systems came online, the assault cannon attached to his left arm cycling up with a sound like a mechanical growl. Ammunition feeds that hadn't been active for a millennium suddenly came alive, feeding shells from storage hoppers that still, impossibly, contained live rounds. The Orks scattered, their earlier curiosity replaced by pure survival instinct. Zagdaka shouted something about falling back, about regrouping, about coming up with a proper plan, but his words were drowned out by the sound of the assault cannon opening fire. The weapon roared, each shot a thunderclap in the enclosed space, heavy caliber shells chewing through ferrocrete and flesh with equal ease. Gripfist, too slow in his retreat, caught 3 rounds across his torso and simply ceased to exist, reduced to component atoms by explosive shells designed to kill space marines. The carnage was instant and absolute. Orks, even young and inexperienced ones, are tough. They can survive wounds that would kill a human, can keep fighting with injuries that would incapacitate a more fragile species. But they are not built to withstand the firepower of a Chaos Dreadnought at point-blank range. Skarshiv made it halfway to the exit before a power fist caught him, closing around his torso with a sickening crunch and lifting him into the air. Valdorkir squeezed, and the Ork's chest cavity imploded, ribs and organs pulped in an instant. But the Dreadnought didn't simply kill Skarshiv and move on. It held the corpse for a moment, optical sensors examining its work with something that might have been satisfaction. Then it threw the body aside with such force that it shattered against the far wall, leaving a green stain that would mark that spot for years to come. This was not combat. This was not a tactical engagement where calculated violence achieved strategic objectives. This was murder, elevated to an art form, killing for killing's sake, the satisfaction of the Nails' demands expressed through overwhelming force. Valdorkir was not fighting to defend himself or eliminate threats. He was fighting because the alternative was to endure the Nails' agony, and 1,000 years of dormant suffering had left him with a deficit of violence that demanded immediate and catastrophic repayment. Zagdaka, watching his crew being systematically dismembered, made a decision that spoke to either tremendous survival instinct or simple Orkish pragmatism. He couldn't fight this thing. Not here, not now, not with the tools he had available. What he could do was survive long enough to warn the others and maybe, just maybe, come back with enough firepower to properly scrap this nightmare machine. The big mech ran, not in blind panic, but with the purposeful speed of someone who has accurately assessed a situation and decided that being elsewhere would be preferable. He made it to the exit, slamming his considerable bulk against the damaged blast doors and squeezing through the gap they had cut earlier. Behind him, he could hear the Dreadnought's footfalls, each impact like a hammer blow against the world's surface, accompanied by the continued roar of its weapons and the wet sounds of Orks dying. Zagdaka burst from the underground facility into what passed for daylight on this blasted world. He didn't look back, didn't stop to count his losses or mourn his dead. He simply ran toward where his transport was parked, his mind already racing ahead to how he would explain this to Warboss Gritstomper and, more importantly, how they could turn this disaster into an opportunity for a proper fight. Behind him, in the depths of the ruined facility, Valdor Kier completed his awakening by methodically killing every orc that remained in the chamber. When the last greenskin had stopped twitching, the Dreadnought stood still for a moment, its optical sensors scanning the carnage it had created. Blood. Green orc blood, so different from the red vital fluid that Horn truly favored, painted the walls and ceiling. Bodies and pieces of bodies were scattered across the floor in positions that suggested violent, painful deaths. The nails, temporarily satisfied by this slaughter, eased their torment to a more manageable level. In the brief respite this provided, something like thought became possible again. Valdor Kier's consciousness, scattered by a millennium of dormancy and the shock of sudden awakening, began to coalesce around certain fundamental questions. Where am I? What is the tactical situation? Where are my battle brothers? His cogitators provided what answers they could. Location: unknown world, coordinates unavailable. Tactical situation: unclear, no allied forces detected, no command structure identified. Unit status: all systems nominal, ammunition at 87%, minor damage to right knee actuator. The information was insufficient, but it would have to do. Valdor Kier had been a warrior long before the nails, and while they had stripped away much of his humanity, they had not entirely eroded his combat instincts. He needed to determine where he was, what forces were present, and whether there were worthy foes to fight. The Orks had been disappointingly weak, barely worth the ammunition he had expended on them. But where there were Orks, there were usually more Orks, and where there were many Orks, there might be battles worth fighting. The Dreadnought turned toward the exit, its massive form barely fitting through the corridor that led to the surface. As it walked, systems continued to come fully online. Targeting systems calibrated themselves against the environment. Tactical overlays populated with sensor data. And deep within the sarcophagus, chemicals and neural impulses began the process of transforming Valdor Kier from a barely conscious killing machine into something even more dangerous. A fully aware and tactical killing machine with 1,000 years of rage to express. Above, on the surface of this dead world, Zagdaka was already halfway to his transport, his lungs burning and his mind racing. He had escaped, and that was good. But he had also left something very dangerous down there, something that was probably going to be very, very bad for everyone involved. As he ran, a grin slowly spread across his scarred face. Yes, this was bad. But it was also the kind of bad that would lead to a really good fight. And if there was one thing Orks loved more than scrap, more than shooting, more than anything else in the entire galaxy, it was a really good fight. Behind him, Valdor Kier emerged into the wan sunlight of a dying world. The Dreadnought stood at the facility's entrance, its optical sensors sweeping across a landscape of ruins and desolation. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of Ork engines could be heard, growing fainter as Zagdaka fled. The Dreadnought's targeting systems tracked the sound, automatically, calculating range and trajectory, but the target was already beyond effective weapons range. No matter. If the greenskins wanted to run, Let them. They would return, and when they did, there would be blood. Always blood, forever blood, until the Nail's demands were met, or until there was nothing left to kill. Valdorkir adjusted his stance, servos whining slightly as they compensated for the damaged knee actuator, and began walking in the direction the Ork had fled. Where there was one Ork transport, there would be an Ork base. And where there was an Ork base, there would be violence enough to satisfy even the most demanding of appetites. The hunt had begun. The battle. Blood for the blood. God Zagdaka burst into Warboss Gritstomper's command bunker with considerably less dignity than he would have preferred, stumbling through the entrance and nearly falling flat on his face. The assembled Orks, who had been engaged in what passed for tactical planning among greenskins, which mostly involved arguing about who got to fight what, turned to stare at the big mech with expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement. "Boss!" Zagdaka gasped, his lungs still burning from his sprint across the wasteland. "Boss, we got a problem. A big problem. Like really big." Gritstomper, a massive Ork who stood a full head taller than any of his companions, and whose power claw was festooned with skulls from a dozen different species, fixed Zagdaka with a baleful glare. "Dis better be good, mech. I was just about to decide which of Desagits gets to lead the charge on that Humi settlement we spotted." "It's a Dreadnought, boss. A Chaos one. We found it down into old ruins, tried to wake it up and, well, it woke up. Real angry-like." The bunker went quiet for a moment as the assembled Orks processed this information. Then, one by one, grins began to spread across scarred green faces. A Dreadnought was a challenge, sure, but it was also an opportunity. Orks lived for opportunities to test themselves against worthy opponents, and a Chaos Dreadnought definitely counted as worthy. "How big?" asked Gritstomper, leaning forward with interest. "About 12 feet, I reckon. Got a big shooty arm and a smashy arm. Killed half me crew before I legged it." "How much armor?" "Thick, real thick. Like you'd need something proper crumpy to get through it." Gritstomper nodded slowly, his mind working through the tactical implications. A Dreadnought wasn't invincible, but it was tough enough that conventional weapons would have trouble penetrating its armor. They would need heavy weapons, concentrated fire, or perhaps something more creative. The warboss's eyes drifted toward the corner of the bunker where his pride and joy rested, a captured Imperial Lascanon that his mech boys had somehow gotten working. It had taken them 3 months and cost 2 lives to make the thing fire without exploding, but now it could punch through damn near anything. "Right, den," Gritstomper said, standing to his full impressive height. "Here's what we's gonna do. Zagdaka, you get back to your workshop and get that Lascanon ready to move. I want it set up on the highest bit of ruins we can find, with a good view of the approach from those old factory bits. Knob snatcher," he pointed at a scarred knob with a missing eye. "You take your boys and set up some barricades. Nothing fancy, just enough to slow the git down and give us time to shoot it. Ripper, Grok, yous take your mobs and spread out on the flanks. When this Dreadnought comes at us, and it will come at us 'cause that's what they do, I want you hitting it from the sides while the Lascanon does the heavy work." The knobs nodded, already moving to carry out their orders. Gritstomper turned back to Zagdaka. "How long till it gets here, you reckon?" The mech boy considered. The Dreadnought had been moving when he left, walking in a specific direction rather than wandering randomly. It was tracking him, following his trail like a predator following wounded prey. "Couple hours maybe. It ain't moving fast, but it's moving steady. And boss?" Zagdaka's expression turned serious. "This thing ain't normal. It's got something wrong with it, something chaosy. When it looks at you, it don't look at you like you's a problem to solve. It looks at you like you's just meat that needs killing." Gritstomper's grin widened. "Perfect. Been too long since we had a proper scrap. Let's show this chaos git how Orks do things." Over the next hour, the Orks transformed a section of the ruins into something resembling a defensive position. Barricades made from scrap metal and pieces of fallen buildings formed rough barriers across the main approaches. The Lascanon was hauled up to the top of a partially collapsed watchtower. its weight requiring the combined efforts of a dozen grots and considerable creative swearing from the mech boys trying to secure it in place. Ork boys took up positions behind the barricades, their choppers and sluggers ready, while the knobs positioned themselves at key points where they could either support the line or rush forward to engage. Gritstomper himself took a position in the center of the defensive line, his massive form serving as both inspiration and threat to his troops. The warboss had fought in dozens of battles, had killed space marines and chaos cultists, and at least one Eldar Farseer who had made the mistake of thinking orcs were too stupid to ambush her. He knew this fight would be different. Space marines were dangerous, but they were also predictable. They followed tactics and doctrine, fought with discipline and coordination. A dreadnought, especially a chaos one, would be different. It would be raw violence given form, the kind of opponent that required not just strength, but also cunning to defeat. The waiting was the hardest part. Orks are not patient by nature, and sitting still while anticipating a fight went against every instinct they possessed. Fights broke out among the boys as boredom and nervous energy combined into violence. Gritstomper had to personally intervene twice to stop his troops from killing each other before the enemy even arrived, cracking skulls together with his power claw to remind them who they should be saving their aggression for. Then, as the sun began to set over the ruined landscape, painting the broken buildings in shades of orange and purple, a new sound joined the ambient noise of the Ork camp. At first, it was barely audible over the general din of greenskin activity. A rhythmic thumping, like a giant's heartbeat, accompanied by the whir of servos and the hiss of hydraulics. It grew steadily louder, the sound echoing between the ruins in ways that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact source. One of the boys, a lookout posted on a high point, suddenly began shouting and pointing. "There it is! I see the git!" Every orc eye turned in the indicated direction, and there, emerging from between two, collapsed. Buildings like a nightmare made manifest, was Valdorkir. The dreadnought moved with steady purpose, each step measured and deliberate, its optical sensors sweeping the area in a pattern that suggested full tactical awareness. The setting sun caught on its armor, making the red paint look like fresh blood, and the brass symbols adorning its chassis seemed to glow with inner fire. "Get ready, boys!" Gritstomper roared. "Here it comes!" The dreadnought paused, its sensors having detected the concentration of orc forces ahead. For a moment, it simply stood there, scanning the defenses, cataloguing the positions and apparent strength of the greenskin forces. Valdorkir's tactical systems were feeding him information, overlaying targeting data on his vision and calculating optimal approaches. But beneath the cold mathematics of warfare, the nails were singing. They had tasted orc blood in the underground facility. Now they demanded more, wanted oceans of it, needed to feel life, extinguished in quantities that would finally ease their eternal demand. The dreadnought began walking forward again, its pace unchanged despite the clear presence of enemy forces. To Valdorkir, this was not a battle that required caution or strategy. This was an opportunity for slaughter, pure and simple. The greenskins had arrayed themselves for his convenience, gathered in one place where he could kill them all systematically and efficiently. "Fire!" Gritstomper shouted, and the orcs opened up with everything they had. Slugger rounds, crude but numerous, stitched across the dreadnought's armor like rain on metal. Bigger weapons, looted Imperial autoguns and bolters, added their heavier reports to the cacophony. The Lascannon spoke with a voice like thunder, its beam of coherent light stabbing through the smoke and dust to strike the dreadnought square in the center of its torso. The hit was perfect, the kind of shot that should have cored through armor plating and detonated the power plant beneath. Instead, the beam scattered across the surface of the dreadnought's armor, diffusing into a spray of light that left scorch marks but failed to penetrate. Zagdaka, watching from his position behind the Lascannon, felt his jaw drop in disbelief. That was impossible. Lascannons cut through armor like it was paper. He had seen this very weapon punch through a battle tank's frontal plate. How had the Dreadnought survived? The answer, had the mech boy been able to understand it, lay in the nature of chaos itself. Valdor Kier's armor was no longer simply physical protection. It had been blessed by ornate tech marines, its substance infused with the essence of the warp, transformed into something that existed partially outside the normal rules of physics. Attacks that should have destroyed it instead found themselves deflected by forces that had nothing to do with material strength and everything to do with the raw power of belief and demonic favor. The Dreadnought's response was immediate and devastating. The assault cannon spun up to full speed and unleashed a stream of fire that chewed through the barricades like they were made of kindling. Orks died, not cleanly, but in explosions of gore as heavy shells found their marks. The power fist lashed out, grabbing a barricade that must have weighed several tons and hurling it aside with casual strength, crushing 3 orcs who couldn't get out of the way fast enough. "Spread out! Don't let it pin you down!" Grit Stomper's tactical instincts were sound. Clustering together just made them easier targets. But even as he shouted the orders, he knew this fight was going worse than he'd expected. The Dreadnought wasn't behaving like a normal opponent. It wasn't seeking cover or trying to preserve itself. It was simply walking forward into the teeth of their fire, taking hits that would have destroyed lesser machines, and killing anything that got within reach. Knobsnatcher led a brave but ultimately doomed charge from the left flank, a dozen boys following him as they rushed toward the Dreadnought's side. If they could get close, if they could hit it with their choppers and power claws in the weak points around its joints, maybe they could disable it. The Knob raised his own power claw high, roaring a challenge that was cut short when the assault cannon swiveled with impossible speed and centered on his position. The stream of fire that followed was surgical in its precision, each shell finding a target, each impact ending a life. Knobsnatcher managed 3 more steps before a round caught him in the chest and detonated, removing his upper torso from existence. The remaining orcs in the charge wavered, their courage failing in the face of such overwhelming firepower. A few turned to run. The Dreadnought's power fist caught the nearest, closing around his leg and swinging him into his companions with enough force to shatter bones and pulp organs. Then it released the broken body and reached for the next target, mechanical fingers closing around an orc's head and squeezing until the skull popped like a wet balloon. This was not a battle. This was a massacre. And deep within his sarcophagus, Valdor Kier reveled in it. The nails sang with joy as orc blood sprayed across his armor, each life extinguished, providing a momentary respite from their torment. But it was never enough. It could never be enough. The nails' demands were infinite, their hunger impossible to truly satisfy. All Valdor could do was feed them and feed them and feed them, hoping that the next kill, the next skull, the next arterial spray would finally grant him peace. Grit Stomper watched his forces being systematically dismantled and made a decision. They couldn't win this fight through conventional means. The Dreadnought was too tough, too well protected, too singularly focused on slaughter. But Orks didn't always need to win through conventional means. The Warboss hefted his power. Claw activated the disruption field that made the weapon more than just a fancy glove, and charged. The Dreadnought's sensors detected the attack immediately, tactical systems flagging Grit Stomper as a priority target based on size, apparent strength, and the obvious quality of his equipment. But Valdor Kier overrode the automatic targeting routines. This was a worthy opponent, an enemy that might provide satisfaction beyond the mere tally of kills. The nails wanted this one alive for a few more seconds, wanted to feel the moment when strength failed and life fled. The Warboss and the Dreadnought met with a crash that echoed across the battlefield. Grit Stomper's power claw locked against Valdor's power fist. Orc strength against Space Marine augmentation mediated through tons of war machine. For a moment, they were matched, neither giving ground, both pouring everything they had into the contest of raw force. Then, Valdor Kier activated his fist's crushing mechanisms. servos whining as they applied pressure far beyond anything biological could match. Gritstomper felt his own power claw beginning to fail, the disruption field flickering as its generators struggled under the strain. The warboss snarled and slammed his free hand against the Dreadnought's chassis, trying to find purchase, trying to leverage his considerable mass into some kind of advantage. His fingers found the chains wrapped around the sarcophagus and held on, using them to pull himself in closer, where the assault cannon couldn't easily target him. The Dreadnought adjusted its tactics, using its greater mass to bull forward, forcing the Ork back step by step. Gritstomper's feet dug furrows in the ground as he fought to maintain his position, muscles screaming with effort, every ounce of his considerable strength focused on not being crushed. And all the while, Valdor Kier was methodically increasing the pressure on the power claw, incrementally tightening his grip, waiting for the moment when metal would fail and Ork flesh would be exposed to his wrath. The power claw gave way with a screech of tortured metal. One of its fingers snapped, then another, the disruption field collapsing entirely as the generators powdered under impossible strain. Gritstomper tried to pull back, tried to disengage, but the Dreadnought held him fast. The power fist shifted its grip from the ruined claw to Gritstomper himself, closing around the warboss's torso with terrible finality. The Ork warboss had 1 second to realize what was about to happen. Then the Dreadnought squeezed, and Gritstomper's reinforced ribcage, which had weathered hits from bolters and chain axes, and even a glancing strike from a power sword, compressed like wet cardboard. The warboss's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He tried to speak, but blood filled his lungs before the words could form. The Dreadnought held him there for a moment, optical sensors fixed on the dying Ork's face, watching the life fade from his eyes. Then, Valdor Kier threw the body aside and turned to face the remaining greenskins. The Orks, witnessing their warboss's death, did not respond with despair or fear. Instead, a kind of collective madness descended upon them, the same instinct that drove their species to find joy in violence, regardless of the odds. They charged, every Ork still capable of movement rushing toward the Dreadnought in a wave of green muscle and crude weapons. If they were going to die, they would die fighting, die as Orks should die, with weapons in hand and enemies before them. The assault cannon sang its song of death, each burst dropping multiple targets. The power fist swung in wide arcs, connecting with flesh and bone and sending broken bodies flying. Valdor Kier fought with the efficiency of a butcher, no movement wasted, every action designed to inflict maximum casualties in minimum time. He stomped forward through the press of greenskins, crushing those too slow to dodge, catching others with his fist, and using them as bludgeons to strike down their companions. And with each kill, the nail's demands grew stronger. What had begun as a tactical engagement had long since descended into pure slaughter. Valdor Kier was no longer fighting to eliminate threats or secure objectives. He was killing because killing was all he had, all that stood between him and the nail's infinite agony. His tactical systems tried to intervene, tried to suggest more efficient kill patterns or better positioning, but their recommendations were drowned out by the red tide of rage that consumed everything else. Zagdaka, watching from his vantage point behind the now useless Lascannon, made his second strategic retreat in as many days. The big mech was brave, or at least brave enough by Ork standards, but he also possessed enough sense to recognize when a fight was truly lost. Every Ork down there was going to die, and throwing his own life away wouldn't change that. Better to survive, better to escape and report back to whatever remnants of the warband were scattered across this world. Perhaps they could regroup, gather more forces, come back with the kind of overwhelming firepower needed to properly destroy this nightmare machine. He slipped away from his position and made his way down the back of the tower, moving quietly in a way that few would expect from an Ork of his size. Behind him, the sounds of battle began to diminish, not because the fighting was ending, but because there were simply fewer Orks left to fight. The Dreadnought's assault cannon continued to fire, but the time between bursts was growing longer as it struggled to find targets among the piles of corpses. By the time Zagdaka reached his transport and gunned the engine, heading away from the battlefield as fast as the ramshackle vehicle would carry him, the last orc died with a chopper in his hand and Valdor Kyr's power fist around his throat. The Dreadnought released the body and stood still, its optical sensors sweeping across the carnage it had created. Bodies, green and broken, covered the ground in every direction. The ruins were painted in arterial sprays and organ matter. The barricades the orcs had built were smashed to kindling, and the air hung heavy with the smell of blood and burnt propellant. The nails, temporarily sated, eased their torment to a bearable level. In the brief window of clarity this provided, Valdor Kyr's consciousness could assess what had occurred. He had killed. How many? His tactical systems provided the count. 47 confirmed kills, possibly more buried under collapsed structures or otherwise unaccounted for. It was a respectable tally, though nothing compared to some of his achievements during the heresy. But numbers were insufficient to satisfy the nails for long. Already, he could feel them beginning to build again, the quiet between storms that preceded their next demand. He needed more. Not immediately, perhaps, but soon. The question was, where to find it? This world seemed sparsely populated, the greenskins apparently scattered across its surface in small groups and settlements. He would need to hunt them systematically, to seek out every concentration of enemies and exterminate them one by one. The Dreadnought began walking again, this time with no specific destination in mind. Valdor Kyr's sensors would detect life signs when he came close enough, and when they did, he would kill whatever generated them. It was simple, direct, exactly the kind of purpose the nails understood. Walk, find enemies, kill them, repeat until the ammunition ran out or the chassis failed, or the blessed relief of final oblivion arrived at last. Somewhere in the ruins ahead, Zagdaka was already planning his next move. The mech boy had seen something important during the battle, something that his instinctive understanding of mechanics had recognized even in the chaos of combat. The Dreadnought's armor might be supernaturally tough, but its joints were still joints. The actuators that powered its movements were still mechanical systems, subject to wear and tear. And that damaged knee actuator he'd noticed during the awakening, that was a weak point, a vulnerability that could be exploited if one had the right tools and sufficient motivation. The big mech drove through the darkening landscape, his mind already assembling plans. He would need different weapons, heavier ones. Maybe that plasma gun he'd been working on, the one that had only exploded twice during testing. Or perhaps he could rig up some kind of trap, something that would immobilize the Dreadnought long enough for concentrated fire to bring it down. The possibilities were numerous, and Zagdaka found himself grinning despite the day's losses. This was the kind of challenge that made being a mech boy worthwhile. This was the kind of problem that required proper orcish ingenuity to solve. Behind him, Valdor Kyr emerged from the ruins onto an open plain, his optical sensors scanning for new targets. The world stretched out before him, broken and desolate, but alive with the potential for violence. And as long as violence remained possible, as long as there were enemies to kill and blood to spill, the nails would have their due, one way or another, through triumph or destruction, through centuries of slaughter or a final, desperate battle. Valdor Kyr would feed the hunger that consumed him. The galaxy had forgotten this Dreadnought, left him to sleep in darkness for 1,000 years. Now he was awake, and the world that had disturbed his slumber would pay the price. Aftermath. Scars on reality. The battle between Valdor Kyr and Gritstomper's warband was not, in the grand scheme of the galaxy's endless conflicts, particularly significant. 47 orcs and one warboss represented a statistical rounding error in a species that numbered in the trillions. The destruction of a few scattered orc settlements on a forgotten backwater world would not meaningfully impact the balance of power in any sector. No imperial records would note this engagement. No historians would preserve its memory for future generations. But in the warp, where the laws of cause and effect bend before the will of the dark gods. The battle's echoes resonated far beyond its physical scope. Khorne's gaze, once attracted to this world by the awakening of his ancient champion, now lingered with interest. The blood god appreciated artistry in slaughter, savored the purity of rage when expressed through overwhelming violence. What WH40K had accomplished was not mere killing. It was destruction elevated to sacrament, bloodshed as worship, the kind of offering that pleased Khorne more than any structured ritual or calculated sacrifice. The world itself began to change in subtle ways. Reality, already thin in places due to the ancient traumas inflicted during the heresy, grew thinner still. The Materium and the Immaterium pressed closer together, separated by a membrane that grew increasingly permeable. Places where Valdor had killed with particular enthusiasm became focal points for this weakening, locations where the boundary between real and unreal was tissue thin. An orc scavenger, venturing into the ruins of Gritstomper's last stand 3 days after the battle, found himself walking through patches where the air seemed to shimmer with heat, despite the world's cool climate. He moved through these areas quickly, instinct warning him that something was wrong even if he couldn't articulate what. When he paused to examine an interesting piece of scrap metal, a power claw finger that had somehow survived intact, he noticed that the blood staining it had not dried or crusted the way blood should. Instead, it remained liquid, almost glistening, and when he touched it, his finger came away not just wet, but warm. The scavenger dropped the metal and backed away, suddenly and profoundly aware that he didn't want to be in this place. He returned to his tribe's settlement and reported what he'd seen, though his explanation was confused and contradictory. The tribe's boss, a cunning warlord named Snickrot, who had survived the Dreadnought's rampage by not being anywhere near it, listened to the report with growing concern. Strange things happening in the ruins, blood that wouldn't dry, air that felt wrong. These were bad signs, indicators of chaos corruption that even orcs could recognize when it became sufficiently obvious. Snickrot made a decision that demonstrated either wisdom or cowardice, depending on one's perspective. He ordered his tribe to abandon their current settlement and relocate to the opposite side of the world, as far from the corrupted ruins as geography would allow. Some of his warriors grumbled about running from a fight, but Snickrot silenced them with brutal efficiency. This wasn't about running from a fight. This was about not fighting battles you couldn't win against enemies that didn't play fair. The evacuation took 2 weeks, during which time WH40K continued his systematic elimination of every living thing he could detect. The Dreadnought had developed a pattern to his hunting, moving in expanding spirals outward from the site of his awakening, killing anything he encountered and then moving on. His ammunition was finally beginning to run low, the assault cannon's reserves depleted to perhaps 30% of capacity. The Power Fist remained fully functional, its crushing power requiring no consumable resources beyond the reactor's energy output. In one engagement, Valdor encountered a small group of feral orcs who had descended to near-primitive savagery over generations of isolation. They attacked him with crude stone weapons and scavenged metal clubs, completely unprepared for the reality of what a Chaos Dreadnought represented. The slaughter was brief and one-sided, memorable only because one of the orcs managed to strike the damaged knee actuator with a lucky blow that briefly locked the joint. Valdor crushed the orc responsible with perhaps more force than strictly necessary, pulverizing the greenskins so completely that nothing recognizable remained. The blow to the actuator, however, had done some damage. Valdor's systems registered increased resistance in that joint, a grinding sensation that suggested something had broken or come loose inside the mechanism. He compensated automatically, redistributing weight and adjusting his gait to minimize strain on the damaged component. But he knew, with the cold certainty of someone who had lived as a war machine for centuries, that this was a problem that would only worsen with time. Eventually, if no repairs were made, the joint would fail completely, leaving him immobilized and vulnerable. Not that vulnerability particularly mattered when there were no enemies left to exploit it. The Ork populations on this world were scattered and disorganized, their numbers having dwindled over years of internecine warfare even before Valdor's arrival. Within 3 weeks of his awakening, the Dreadnought had killed or scattered every greenskin within his operational radius. The silence that followed was strange and oppressive, broken only by the wind howling through ruins and the mechanical sounds of his own movements. For the first time since awakening, Valdor Kier experienced something approximating boredom. The nails still demanded violence, still screamed for blood and death, but there were no targets available to satisfy them. He stood in the center of what had once been an Ork settlement, now reduced to corpses and burning structures, and felt the frustration of hunger with nothing to consume. His tactical systems suggested various courses of action: conserve energy, seek a defendable position, attempt to contact other chaos forces, but none addressed the fundamental problem. He needed to kill, and there was nothing left to kill. This is when Zagdaka made his move. The big Mech had spent the weeks following his flight gathering resources and assembling a plan. He had salvaged every heavy weapon he could find, had bullied and cajoled other surviving Ork groups into contributing fighters and equipment, had even convinced Snickrot to loan him a dozen of his best boys for what Zagdaka described as a proper scrap. The truth, though Zagdaka would never have phrased it this way, was that he had become obsessed with the Dreadnought. The machine represented a challenge unlike any he had faced before, a problem that required the very best of Orkish ingenuity and violence to solve. The trap Zagdaka designed was, by Ork standards, remarkably sophisticated. He had identified a location where the terrain would force the Dreadnought into a relatively narrow passage between 2 collapsed buildings. In this choke point, he positioned his heavy weapons: 2 looted autocannons, a plasma gun that only occasionally exploded, and a weapon of his own design that he called a Mega Blaster, but which was actually just several custom shooters welded together and powered by an unstable reactor core. But the real genius of the plan lay in the bait. Zagdaka had observed that the Dreadnought responded aggressively to any detected life signs, prioritizing larger groups over individuals. So he positioned a squad of boys, volunteers who were either very brave or very stupid, in plain sight beyond the kill zone. Their job was simple: make noise, attract the Dreadnought's attention, and then run like hell when it came for them, leading it straight through the passage where the heavy weapons waited. The plan worked better than Zagdaka had any right to expect. Valdor Kier's sensors detected the concentration of Ork life signs and immediately began moving to engage. The nails, thrilled by the prospect of fresh targets, drove him forward with single-minded purpose. His tactical systems flagged the choke point as a potential ambush location, but the warnings were drowned out by the overwhelming need to close with the enemy and kill them. Besides, what did it matter if it was a trap? He was a Dreadnought, armored against all conventional weapons, blessed by Khorne himself. No ambush could stop him. He entered the passage at full stride, power fist raised and assault cannons spinning up to firing speed. The Ork boys fled before him, scrambling over rubble in their haste to escape. And then the world erupted in fire and thunder as every weapon Zagdaka had assembled opened up simultaneously. The autocannons spoke first, their heavy shells hammering into the Dreadnought's armor with the consistency of a drumroll. Each hit sparked and cratered the ceramite, and while none penetrated, the cumulative effect was significant. Valdor's sensor systems registered armor integrity dropping percentages at a time, damage markers appearing on his tactical display like flowers blooming. The plasma gun added its voice to the chorus, a bolt of superheated matter that struck his left shoulder and actually punched through the outer armor layer before dissipating against the adamantium beneath. And then the Mega Blaster fired, and everything became chaos. Zagdaka's weapon was less a gun than a barely controlled explosion pointed in a specific direction. When its trigger was pulled, the unstable reactor core dumped its entire energy reserve through the firing mechanism in a single catastrophic discharge. The beam that emerged was ragged and inconsistent, more like a spray of energy than a coherent bolt, but it carried enough power to carve through tank armor. The Mega Blaster's energy spray caught Valdorkir directly in the torso, hitting several systems simultaneously. The assault cannon's ammunition feed severed, leaving it unable to reload, even though shells remained in the hopper. The power distribution network that ran across his chest cracked and failed, forcing the reactor to route power through backup systems. And most critically, a feedback surge traveled back through the damaged circuits and into the sarcophagus itself, causing brief but intense disruption to the life support systems. For Valdorkir, the sensation was like being stabbed directly in the brain. His consciousness, normally maintained through chemical and electrical support, flickered as systems struggled to compensate for the damage. The nails, denied their usual regulatory mechanisms, went into overdrive, flooding his awareness with pain so pure and absolute that for a moment, just a moment, even they couldn't maintain their grip on his sanity. He screamed, a sound that emerged from his Vox speakers as static and distortion, but that carried the weight of genuine torment. The Dreadnought staggered, servos locking and unlocking randomly as command signals became scrambled. His right leg, already weakened by the damaged actuator, gave way entirely, dropping him to one knee. The impact sent cracks radiating through the ferrocrete beneath, and dust rose in clouds around his collapsed form. Zagdaka, watching from his position behind the weapons emplacement, couldn't believe his optical senses. They'd done it. They'd actually brought the damn thing down. "Again!" he roared. "Shoot it again, while it's down!" But the autocannons had overheated, their barrels glowing cherry red from sustained fire. The plasma gun was venting coolant in white jets, its containment temporarily unstable. And the Mega Blaster, well, the Mega Blaster had worked exactly once, which was about the limit of what could be expected from Ork superweapons. The weapon's frame was cracked, smoke pouring from breaches in the casing, and any attempt to fire it again would almost certainly result in a catastrophic explosion that would kill everyone nearby. In the choke point, Valdorkir fought to regain control of his systems. Damage reports flooded his awareness, each one a catalogue of failures and degraded capabilities. Life support, functioning at 63% capacity. Power distribution, rerouted through backup systems, efficiency reduced by 40%. Mobility, right leg actuator offline, left leg functional but compensating for additional load. Weapons, power fist operational, assault cannon jammed and unreloadable. But more important than any of these technical details was the simple, terrible fact that he was still alive. He had not been destroyed. He had not found his final rest in glorious battle. The nails, temporarily confused by the system failures, were already reasserting themselves, their demands returning with redoubled intensity. And now, kneeling in the rubble with damaged systems and depleted ammunition, Valdorkir felt something he had not experienced in centuries. Genuine rage. Not the nail's endless artificial fury, but real anger born from his own consciousness. These greenskins had hurt him. They had brought him low. They would pay for that presumption. The Dreadnought began to rise, servos whining as they compensated for the damaged leg. Zagdaka, seeing this, felt his earlier triumph curdle into concern. It was still functional. After everything they'd thrown at it, the nightmare machine was still capable of movement, and it was turning toward their position, optical sensors glowing red with murderous intent. Boss," said one of the boys nervously. "Maybe we should—" "Run!" Zagdaka didn't wait to hear the rest of the suggestion. The big mech was already moving, abandoning the weapon emplacement and sprinting toward the nearest cover. The other Orks followed, their earlier bravery evaporating in the face of that crimson gaze. Behind them, the Dreadnought began its pursuit, moving slower than before, but with terrible determination. Each step was labored, the damaged actuator forcing an awkward, limping gait, but each step brought it closer to those who had dared to wound it. The chase that followed was less a battle than a prolonged execution. Valdorkir could not move. Quickly, but he didn't need to. The Orks, fleeing in panic, made mistakes that cost them dearly. Some ran into dead ends and were cornered, their deaths made leisurely rather than quick, because the Dreadnought had time to take pleasure in their fear. Others were caught when their endurance failed, their lungs giving out before they could escape the relentless machine's pursuit. The power fist rose and fell, each impact ending a life and adding another skull to the blood god's eternal tally. Zagdaka managed to survive by being both clever and lucky. When the pursuit became too close, he would duck into structures too small for the Dreadnought to easily enter, forcing it to waste time finding another way around or simply tearing through obstacles. When distance allowed, he would set up small traps and impediments, nothing that would seriously damage the machine, but enough to slow it down and buy seconds of precious escape time. A barrel of promethium rigged to explode when disturbed. A section of floor weakened to collapse under the Dreadnought's weight. Small victories that added up to survival. Eventually, exhaustion and desperation drove the mech boy to a decision he would later claim was tactical brilliance, but which at the time was pure pragmatism. He couldn't outrun the Dreadnought forever. He couldn't hide, not with his life signs detectable by whatever sensors the machine used. And he certainly couldn't fight it alone, not after seeing what it did to Grit Stomper. The only option left was to get off this world entirely, to abandon this hunt and survive to build and scrap another day. Zagdaka made for the nearest functional spacecraft, a ramshackle transport that he'd helped build months earlier. The ship was barely spaceworthy, its engines held together by faith and baling wire. But it could achieve orbit if properly motivated. The mech boy reached it with perhaps 100 meters lead on the pursuing Dreadnought, just enough time to scramble into the cockpit and begin the startup sequence. The engines coughed, sputtered, and finally caught, belching black smoke and flame. Valdor Kier, watching the ship begin its ascent, fired his assault cannon on pure reflex, even though he knew the weapon was jammed. His tactical systems screamed warnings about the escaping target, suggested alternative actions, calculated pursuit vectors. But the Dreadnought could not follow. He could only stand there, damaged and depleted, watching as the last significant Ork presence on this world escaped into the void beyond his reach. The frustration was intolerable. The Nails, denied their prize, redoubled their assault on his consciousness, punishment for this failure. Valdor Kier raised his power fist and brought it down against the nearest wall, pulverizing Ferrocrete to dust, the action providing brief satisfaction before the Nails demanded more. He struck the wall again and again until the structure collapsed entirely, burying him under tons of rubble that he would need to excavate himself from. From orbit, Zagdaka watched the dust cloud rise from where the Dreadnought had been. For a moment, he allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the machine had finally been destroyed. But no, he knew better. That thing down there was too tough, too persistent, too filled with rage to be stopped by something as mundane as a building falling on it. It would dig itself out, repair what it could, and continue its hunt for prey that no longer existed. The big mech set course for the nearest inhabited system, his mind already composing the report he would deliver to whatever Ork authorities he could find. There was a Chaos Dreadnought loose on that world, a machine of murder that would kill anything and everything it encountered. Someone needed to know. Someone needed to do something about it. And most importantly, someone who wasn't Zagdaka needed to be the one to deal with the bloody thing, because he had tried twice and nearly died both times. As the ship accelerated away from the doomed world, Zagdaka allowed himself one final look back at the planet that had nearly become his grave. From this distance it looked peaceful, just another lifeless rock among billions. But he knew the truth. Down there, buried under rubble, but already beginning to dig his way free, was a nightmare that would haunt this sector for years to come. A weapon without a war to fight. A warrior without a cause to serve. A consciousness trapped in a prison of ceramite and rage, doomed to kill and kill and kill, until either the targets ran out, or the machine finally achieved the destruction it secretly craved. Broader implications. The story of WH40K and the Orks who awakened him is, in one sense, a small tale. One dreadnought, one forgotten world, a few dozen casualties in a galaxy where billions die every day. The Imperium would not notice this world's fate. The forces of chaos would not celebrate this minor triumph. Even the Orks, who had suffered most directly from the Dreadnought's fury, would likely forget about it within a generation or two. After all, they had been in plenty of fights and would be in plenty more. One particularly tough opponent was just part of the background noise of their existence. But in another sense, this story illustrates something fundamental about the nature of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It demonstrates how past sins echo through millennia, how weapons forged in ancient conflicts continue to kill long after their creators have perished. The World Eater's Legion fell to chaos during the Horus Heresy, an event that occurred 10,000 years before the current era. Yet here, in the present, a warrior from that ancient time continues to fight, his rage undiminished by the centuries, his purpose unchanged despite the complete collapse of the cause he once served. This is the true horror of chaos corruption, particularly cornate corruption. It is not a temporary madness that can be cured or contained. It is a fundamental transformation of being, a rewiring of consciousness around new and terrible principles. WH40K cannot choose to stop killing, any more than a human can choose to stop breathing. The butcher's nails have made violence his sole means of achieving relief from suffering, and Khorne's blessing has made that violence eternal. He is a perpetual motion machine of murder, self-sustaining and inexorable, able to continue his slaughter as long as power flows and targets present themselves. The implications for the Imperium, should they ever learn of this world's fate, are troubling. How many more ancient war machines sleep in forgotten corners of the galaxy? How many dreadnoughts, entombed during the heresy or the wars that followed, remain in hibernation awaiting some trigger to wake them? The Mechanicus has records of thousands of chaos artifacts and war machines that went missing during various campaigns. Some were surely destroyed, their remains scattered across dead worlds or lost in warp storms. But others, perhaps many others, simply wait in darkness, their power cores in standby, their occupants dreaming dreams of blood and fury. And what happens when they wake? WH40K was found by Orks, whose curiosity and mechanical aptitude combined to overcome the seals that had held him dormant. But Orks are not the only scavengers in the galaxy. Rogue traders seek profit in the ruins of the past. Chaos cultists search for relics to empower their rituals. Even Imperial archaeotech recovery teams occasionally stumble upon things they do not understand and should not disturb. Any of these groups, encountering a dormant chaos dreadnought, might make the same mistake WH40K made. They might see it as salvage, or a curiosity, or a weapon to be studied and controlled. They might try to wake it, to harness its power for their own purposes. They would be wrong. A chaos dreadnought, especially one of the World Eaters, is not a weapon that can be controlled or directed. It is a natural disaster with consciousness, a force of pure destruction that will turn on anyone and anything that provides a target for its rage. The only safe way to deal with such a machine is to destroy it utterly, to reduce it to molecular components and scatter those components across different star systems. Anything less risks creating another tragedy, like the one that befell WH40K's warband. The world where WH40K now resides has effectively become a death trap, a place where the boundary between material and immaterial has grown dangerously thin thanks to sustained cornate presence. The Dreadnought's continued slaughter, fed by his patron god's approval, has transformed what was once merely a ruined world into something approaching a demon world in miniature. The blood that is spilled does not dry properly. The air tastes of brass and copper. Reality itself has begun to warp around the focal points of greatest violence, creating phenomena that would drive human observers to madness and attract demonic entities looking for easy access to real space. Eventually, if left unchecked, this world could become a permanent ornate shrine, a place where the barriers between dimensions are so degraded that demons can manifest without the need for summoning or sacrifice. From there, corruption might spread to neighboring systems, carried by warp currents and the attention of the blood god himself. A single awakened Dreadnought could, given enough time and the right circumstances, become the seed for a chaos incursion that threatens an entire sector. This is why the Inquisition maintains such strict protocols about chaos artifacts and corruption. This is why entire worlds are subjected to exterminatus when chaos taint is discovered, regardless of whether the population could theoretically be saved through other means. Because chaos is not a problem that can be solved. It can only be contained, isolated, and hopefully destroyed before it spreads. Every artifact allowed to remain in circulation. Every corrupted site left uncleansed. Every ancient war machine permitted to continue its existence represents a potential flashpoint for catastrophe. For the Orks, the lesson is simpler, but no less important. Some things should not be poked with sticks, no matter how interesting they look. Zagdaka learned this lesson the hard way, paying for his curiosity with the lives of his entire crew and coming within meters of paying with his own life. The big mech would go on to have a long and successful career, building dozens of impressive war machines and participating in numerous successful wargs. But he would never again attempt to wake up a sleeping Dreadnought, and he would advise other mech boys to avoid them as well. Of course, being Orks, most of them would ignore this advice. Orkish culture doesn't really have a concept of institutional memory or learned caution. Each new generation of mech boys must discover these lessons for themselves through direct and often fatal experience. This is why Orks, despite being technologically capable enough to loot and operate sophisticated equipment, never develop into a truly advanced civilization. They cannot build on the accumulated knowledge of previous generations because they lack the patience and discipline to learn from others' mistakes. Which brings us to perhaps the most important implication of this story. It illustrates the fundamental difference between species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Humans, for all their flaws and limitations, can learn from history. They can study past mistakes and attempt to avoid repeating them. The Mechanicus maintains vast archives of dangerous technologies and forbidden knowledge, precisely to prevent future generations from unleashing horrors like the Men of Iron or the weapons of the Dark Age. The Inquisition documents every chaos incursion and xenos threat, building databases of vulnerabilities and weaknesses that can be exploited in future conflicts. But chaos never learns and never changes. It simply is, eternal and inevitable, as much a part of the universe's fabric as gravity or time. The World Eaters fell to Horn during the heresy, and every World Eater's warrior who exists 10,000 years later fights with the same mindless ferocity, driven by the same nails, serving the same blood god. There is no progression, no evolution, no possibility of redemption or growth. There is only the endless cycle of violence feeding more violence, rage sustaining more rage, blood demanding more blood. And the Orks, well, the Orks will always be Orks. They will always find the shiny things in the rubble and try to make them work. They will always charge toward the sound of gunfire with grins on their faces and weapons in their hands. They will always see the galaxy as one vast playground designed specifically for their amusement, never quite understanding why everyone else seems so stressed about everything. This fundamental optimism, this inability to take threats seriously, is both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. It makes them fearless in the face of horrors that would break other species, but it also leads them to make catastrophically poor decisions on a regular basis. So what became of Valdor Kier after Zagdaka's escape? The Dreadnought spent several hours digging himself out from under the collapsed building, his servos straining against the weight of tons of rubble. When he finally emerged, covered in dust and showing new damage to his already battered armor, he found himself alone on a world that had become a wasteland. The Orks were gone, either killed or fled. The few remaining feral greenskins had learned to avoid the areas where he operated, changing their patterns to stay far from the mechanical demon that stalked their world. For a time, perhaps a few weeks or months, Valdor hunted the edges of Ork territory, picking off stragglers and isolated groups. But the kills became less frequent, the intervals between battles longer. The Nail's demands grew more insistent as satisfaction became harder to achieve. Eventually, Valdor found himself standing in the ruins of Gritstomper's former stronghold, optical sensors sweeping across a landscape empty of life, and felt something approaching despair. He could continue hunting, could systematically search every ruin and cave on this world until he had exterminated every living thing capable of registering on his senses. But then what? The planet would be dead, truly dead, nothing remaining but stone and metal and his own inexorable existence. The Nails would scream for targets that no longer existed, their demands unfulfillable, their torment infinite. He would be trapped in a hell of his own creation, conscious but unable to achieve even the temporary relief that slaughter provided. The Dreadnought's reactor could function for decades, perhaps centuries, before fuel depletion forced a shutdown. His chassis, maintained by automated self-repair systems, would last even longer. Barring catastrophic damage, Valdor Kier could remain operational on this dead world for millennia, a solitary figure stalking through ruins, searching eternally for prey that would never come. This was the true curse of the World Eaters, the price of the Nails and Khorne's blessing. Not death in glorious battle, which at least offered finality, but this. Existence without purpose, rage without outlet, consciousness trapped in an inescapable cycle of violence and despair. The Emperor had once described the World Eaters as weapons that would never obey their own desires before those of the Imperium. But what happened when the weapon outlived its purpose? What became of the blade when there was nothing left to cut? Valdor Kier stood motionless in that ruined courtyard for 3 days, his systems running on minimal power, his consciousness turned inward in something approximating contemplation. Then his sensors detected something, a ship entering the system from warp space. Not an Ork vessel, based on the energy signature. Something larger, more sophisticated. Perhaps an Imperial patrol, or a merchant convoy that had wandered off the standard routes, or even another Chaos warband drawn by the warp disturbances his presence had created. It didn't matter what it was. What mattered was that it represented prey, targets, the possibility of satisfying the Nail's endless hunger. Valdor Kier's systems came back to full operational status, weapons cycling through startup sequences, targeting systems calibrating for orbital engagement. He couldn't reach the ship directly, couldn't fire on something that far away with his depleted weapons. But they would send down a landing party eventually. They always did. Curiosity or greed or strategic interest would bring them to the surface, and when they came, he would be waiting. The Dreadnought began walking toward the most likely landing zones, each step measured and deliberate, damaged actuator grinding with every movement. Behind him, the ruins of the Ork settlement smoldered, the bodies of the slain slowly decomposing under an uncaring sky. And above, in the cold void of space, an unsuspecting ship approached a world that had become a trap, piloted by people who had no idea what awaited them below. The cycle would continue. Violence would breed more violence. Blood would call for more blood. And Valdor Kier, the damned soul trapped within a walking tomb, would fight and kill and rage until either his systems finally failed or someone powerful enough to destroy him arrived to end his torment. There was no escape, no redemption, no hope of anything except the next battle and the brief relief it might provide. This is the price of chaos. This is the fate of those who pledge themselves to the ruinous powers. And this is the nightmare that the Imperium, in its paranoid vigilance, works every day to prevent. For every WH40K who awakens, a dozen more potential tragedies are prevented through the eternal watchfulness of those who guard against chaos in all its forms. But the galaxy is vast, and the Imperium's reach is not infinite. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, other dreadnoughts sleep. Other ancient warriors wait in stasis, their rage preserved like insects in amber, ready to be unleashed should the right or wrong conditions manifest. And every day, scavengers and explorers and foolish adventurers dig through the ruins of the past, searching for treasures and finding nightmares instead. The Orks who awakened WH40K did so out of curiosity, out of the simple desire to see if they could make the interesting machine work. They paid for that curiosity with their lives, died to the last Ork in battles they had no chance of winning. Their mistake was thinking of the Dreadnought as a thing, an object to be studied and potentially controlled. They failed to understand that it was a person, a consciousness that hated and hungered and suffered in ways they could never comprehend. But perhaps that ignorance was a blessing. Perhaps not understanding the depths of WH40K's torment spared them some small measure of horror before they died. They faced a monster, yes, but a monster whose nature they couldn't fully grasp. They never had to contemplate what it would be like to exist as he existed, to spend eternity trapped within a shell of metal with only rage and pain for company. That understanding, that true comprehension of the Dreadnought's hell, is reserved for those with the capacity to imagine such suffering. The humans who might one day encounter him, who might look into his optical sensors and recognize something of themselves in the rage that burns there. The Space Marines, who might face him in battle, who would know exactly what he was and what he had sacrificed in service to the blood god. These would be the ones who truly understood the horror of his existence, and that understanding would make their fear all the more profound. But for now, WH40K is alone on his dead world, waiting for the next batch of prey to deliver themselves to his wrath. The nails sing their eternal song, the reactor hums with barely contained power, the chassis, damaged but functional, carries his consciousness across landscapes of ruin and desolation. And somewhere in the depths of his being, in the tiny portion of his mind that the nails haven't completely consumed, WH40K hopes that whoever comes next will be strong enough to finally end this, to deliver him from the curse of eternal warfare and grant him the oblivion he can no longer achieve on his own. But he knows, with the terrible certainty that comes from centuries of experience, that this hope is futile. The next targets will die like all the others. The battles will continue. The cycle will perpetuate. And he will march on, rage incarnate, until the heat death of the universe or his own final destruction, whichever comes first. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, and where even the dead cannot find rest. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the terrifying encounter between Orks and a World Eater's Dreadnought, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer 40K lore. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are countless stories of horror and heroism, and we're here to tell them all. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne, and remember, some things in the ruins should stay buried.